I walked through my own front door with anniversary flowers, only to find my husband, Richard, and my sister, Lydia, together in our master bedroom. They did not just break my heart. They took my home. They claimed I was strong enough to start over, while Lydia was too weak to survive on her own. They truly thought they had won. But they forgot one very important thing. While Richard owned the deed to the house, I owned the brains of the business that paid for it. I did not cry. I did not beg. Instead, I signed one legal document that triggered a trap they never saw coming. Within months, their stolen life collapsed into ruins. Now, Lydia is standing on a street corner, holding a ragged cardboard sign and begging for a loaf of bread. Before I share the exact moment, I handed her that bread and walked away for good. Please tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? Your support helps us share these lessons of resilience. Note: although this story is dramatized for your entertainment, the message of karma and the importance of personal strength are very real and carry true value. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the manicured lawn of our home in Connecticut. It was a beautiful Tuesday. To anyone else, it was just another day in the suburbs. But to me, it was supposed to be a celebration. That day marked exactly 15 years since I sat at our kitchen table and drafted the first business plan for our architectural firm. 15 years of hard work. 15 years of late nights and cold coffee. I had stopped at the local florist on my way home to buy a hang-from bouquet of white lilies. They were Richard's favorite. I wanted the house to smell like success and love when he walked through the door. I remember the weight of the keys in my hand as I reached for the front door. The brass felt cool against my palm. I was home 3 hours early. I wanted to surprise him. I wanted to tell him that we had just landed the Harrison account, a contract worth over $2 million. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Usually, the hum of the air conditioner or the soft sound of the jazz station Richard loved would fill the foyer. But today, there was only silence. I set the lilies on the mahogany side table and kicked off my heels. As I walked toward the stairs, I noticed a pair of shoes near the coat closet. They were red silk pumps. They were expensive. They were flashy. And they belonged to my younger sister, Lydia. I felt a small smile touch my lips. I thought Lydia had come over to surprise me too. She had been through a rough divorce recently, and I had been her rock. I paid her rent for 6 months. I bought her groceries. I listened to her cry for hours on end. I loved her. She was my only sister. I climbed the stairs quietly, imagining the look on their faces when I walked in. I reached the master bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. I heard a laugh. It was a soft, feminine giggle that I recognized instantly, but it was followed by a low, intimate murmur from my husband. My heart did not just skip a beat. It stopped. It felt as if the air in the hallway had turned to ice. I pushed the door open. Just a few inches. There they were. My husband of 15 years and my sister. The shock was so physical that I had to lean against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. I did not scream. I could not. My throat felt like it was filled with sand. I watched them for a moment, unable to look away from the wreckage of my life. On the nightstand, my wedding photo sat. We were laughing in that picture, standing on a beach in Hawaii. But as I looked closer, I realized the frame had been turned face down. It was tucked away, as if my presence was an inconvenience to their fun. "Richard?" I finally found my voice. It sounded like a stranger's voice. Small and broken. They scrambled apart. Richard looked startled, but only for a second. There was no shame in his eyes, only irritation. Lydia, however, did not look startled at all. She smoothed her hair and looked at me. And then I saw it. A small, triumphant smirk played at the corners of her mouth. It was a look of victory. "Martha, you are home early," Richard said. He stayed on the bed, not even bothering to reach for his shirt. "How long?" I whispered. "How long has this been happening?" Lydia was the one who answered. She stood up and walked toward the vanity, picking up my expensive perfume and spraying it on her wrists. 2 years, Martha. It has been 2 years. We were just waiting for the right time to tell you. 2 years. While I was working 60 hours a week to build our firm, they were together. While I was comforting Lydia during her divorce, she was in my bed. Every holiday, every dinner, every I love you from Richard. It was all a lie. The room began to spin. The walls I had painted myself, the curtains I had picked out, the life I had built. It all felt like a movie set that was being torn down while I was still standing on the stage. I was 60 years old, and in a single afternoon my world had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The confrontation did not stay in the bedroom. It moved downstairs to the living room, the place where we usually hosted Christmas parties for our neighbors. I sat on the edge of the velvet armchair, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Richard sat opposite me, looking perfectly calm. He had a manila envelope in his hand. Lydia stood behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder. She was playing the part of the fragile, hunted bird now. "Martha," Richard began, his voice cold and professional. It was the same voice he used with contractors. "There is no easy way to say this. I want a divorce, and I want you out of this house." I stared at him. "Out of the house?" "Richard, we bought this place together. I designed the kitchen. I spent 10 years making this a home." He shook his head slowly. He pulled a piece of paper from the envelope and slid it across the coffee table. "Actually, we did not buy it together. This house was purchased with the $500,000 I inherited from my parents. Since your name was never added to the deed, it is legally my separate property." I looked at the document. It was true. At the time of the purchase, I had been so busy with the firm that I told him to handle the paperwork. I trusted him. I never thought I needed to protect myself from the man I loved. "You can stay with a friend tonight," Richard continued. "Lydia needs the stability more than you do. You are strong, Martha. You have always been the tough one. You can start over. Lydia, she is sensitive. She needs this house to feel safe." Lydia wiped a fake tear from her eye. "I am so sorry, Martha. But we are in love. You have your career. You have your strength. I have nothing." The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. She had nothing because she refused to work. She had nothing because she spent every cent I ever gave her on clothes and wine. And now, she was using my own strength as a weapon against me. Because I was capable, I deserved to be homeless. Because she was a parasite, she deserved my life. "It is raining outside, Richard," I said, looking out the window at the sudden downpour. "You are really going to throw me out in the rain?" "I have already filed the papers," he said, standing up. "My lawyer advised me that the sooner we establish separate residences, the better. Your things are already packed in the garage. Just 2 suitcases. You can come back for the rest later, but only when I am here to supervise." I stood up. I did not beg. My father always told me that a lady never begs for a seat at a table where she is no longer welcome. I walked to the garage. There, sitting on the cold concrete floor, were 2 old suitcases. My life had been reduced to what could fit in a trunk. I opened one of the bags. On top of my sweaters was a small silver-framed photograph. It was the only thing they hadn't managed to ruin. It was a picture of my mother and father on their wedding day. They looked so happy, so certain of the future. I gripped the frame until my knuckles turned white. I felt a surge of something hot and sharp beneath the grief. It was not just anger. It was a cold, calculating realization. Richard and Lydia thought they had stripped me of everything. They thought the house was the prize. They thought the mahogany floors and the zip code were the source of my power. They forgot that Richard was just a face. A handsome face that looked good in a suit while talking to city planners. But I was the one who understood the tax laws. I was the one who held the licenses. I was the one who managed the 5 bank accounts that kept the firm's heart beating. I dragged my suitcases out into the driveway. The rain soaked through my silk blouse in seconds. I looked back at the glowing windows of my home. I saw the silhouette of Richard and Lydia in the kitchen, probably pouring a glass of the expensive wine I had bought to celebrate our anniversary. I got into my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had no home. I had no husband. I had only the clothes on my back and a small savings account they did not know about. But as I put the car in reverse, I whispered to the empty passenger seat, "You think I am strong enough to start over? Fine. Just wait until you see what I do next." I drove away into the dark, rainy night, leaving behind the only life I had ever known. But for the first time in years, my eyes were wide open. I was 60 years old, homeless and heartbroken. But Richard and Lydia had made one fatal mistake. They had left the brains of the operation with nothing left to lose. The first few weeks after the locks were changed felt like a long, feverish dream. I found myself living in the spare bedroom of my oldest friend, Clara. Clara was a widow who lived in a small 2-bedroom bungalow on the edge of town. She was kind, and she never asked me for a dime. But every night I lay on that narrow guest bed and felt the heavy weight of my own displacement. At 60 years old, I was supposed to be thinking about retirement. I was supposed to be planning trips to the coast and spending my afternoons in a garden. Instead, I was waking up at 4 in the morning to the sound of Clara's old radiator clanking in the corner. I knew I could not stay there forever. My pride would not allow it. I had less than $5,000 in a personal savings account that Richard had forgotten about. It was not enough to rent a decent apartment. Not with the way prices were in this part of the country. So, I did what I had to do. I went looking for work. I remember walking into the Silver Skillet, a local diner that smelled of burnt coffee and maple syrup. The owner, a man named Bill, looked at my resume and then looked at my face. He saw the expensive haircut I still had and the designer watch on my wrist. "You are overqualified, Martha," he said, wiping his hands on a greasy apron. "This is a fast-paced floor. You will be on your feet for 8 hours straight. Are you sure?" "I am sure, Bill," I told him. I looked him straight in the eye. "I need the work, and I am tougher than I look." The first week was a brutal awakening. My body was not used to this kind of labor. By the end of my shift, my back felt like it was being scorched by a hot iron. But it was my hands that suffered the most. I spent hours plunging them into basins of scalding, soapy water to help the busboys when the diner got busy. One evening, after a particularly long double shift, I sat at the small kitchen table in Clara's house. I looked down at my hands. They were red and splotchy. My knuckles were swollen, and the skin was cracked from the harsh chemicals of the dish soap. These were the same hands that had once drafted the blueprints for luxury office buildings. These were the hands that had signed million-dollar contracts. Now, they were the hands of a woman who struggled to even hold a fork. The worst part, however, was not the physical pain. It was a pity. One afternoon, a woman I knew from the local country club walked into the diner. She saw me wearing my polyester apron, carrying a tray of half-eaten burgers. She gasped. She didn't mean to be cruel, but the look of pure, unadulterated pity in her eyes was worse than a slap in the face. "Oh, Martha," she whispered, her voice dripping with sympathy. "Is it really that bad? We heard about Richard and, well, we heard you lost everything. If you need a little loan, just let us know." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. I wanted to tell her that I was fine. I wanted to tell her that I was a victim of a crime. But I just took her order for a Cobb salad and moved on. That night I didn't cry. I sat in the dark and felt the anger starting to harden. It was becoming a cold, sharp stone in my chest. I looked at my swollen hands and realized something. Richard and Lydia had taken my house. They had taken my reputation. But they had not taken my mind. Clara walked into the kitchen and saw me staring at my hands. "You don't have to do this, Martha," she said softly. "You can find a desk job. Something that doesn't hurt so much." "No," I replied, my voice steady. "I need to remember this pain, Clara. It is the fuel I need. Richard and Lydia think they have won because I am down. They think I am a broken woman. But they are about to find out that a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room." I stayed up late that night, doing the diner's bookkeeping for Bill. He had been struggling with his taxes, and I offered to help. As I ran the numbers, my brain felt alive for the first time in months. The swelling in my hands didn't matter. The pity of my friends didn't matter. I was starting to see a path through the valley of shadows, and at the end of that path, I saw a fire waiting for Richard and Lydia. While I was serving breakfast specials and scrubbing floors, Richard and Lydia were busy celebrating. I knew this because I could not stop myself from checking their social media pages. It was a form of self-torture, but it was also a way to gather intelligence. Lydia was posting constantly. She posted photos of herself in my kitchen, drinking wine from my favorite crystal glasses. She posted photos of their new garden, which I had spent years cultivating. She even dared to post a picture of my old master bedroom with the caption, "Starting our new life in our forever home. Love wins." The comments were filled with people congratulating them. It seemed the whole town had forgotten about the woman who actually built that life. But as the months went by, I noticed a change in the tone of their posts. Richard looked tired. The photos of expensive dinners were replaced by photos of him working late at the office. I knew what was happening before he did. You see, Richard was a salesman. He was charming. He was handsome. And he knew how to talk to city council members. But he was not an architect in his soul. He didn't understand the intricate details of the building codes. He didn't know how to navigate the complex relationships with our long-term contractors. I began to hear rumors from my old contacts. A major developer, Mr. Henderson, was furious because a project had been delayed by 3 months due to a filing error. Another client had pulled their contract because Richard had missed a crucial deadline. One night, I sat in Clara's spare room with an old laptop I had managed to buy second-hand. I began to look through the digital copies of our firm's founding documents. I had kept a backup on a private cloud server that Richard never even knew existed. As I scrolled through the fine print of the partnership agreements, I found it. The non-compete clause. I remembered the day we signed it. We were sitting in a lawyer's office 12 years ago. Richard had been so eager to get to lunch that he hadn't even read the final version. He just signed where I told him to sign. The clause was ironclad. It stated that if any partner sold their shares to a third party, the remaining partners would be prohibited from practicing architecture within a 50-mile radius for a period of 5 years. It was a standard protection we had put in to prevent a partner from leaving and stealing all our clients. At the time, Richard had laughed. "Why would I ever leave you, Martha? We are a team." Now, that team was dead, and that clause was a loaded gun sitting on the table. I realized that Richard was drowning. He was trying to maintain the lifestyle Lydia demanded on a shrinking income. He was making mistakes. He was losing his grip. He thought he was the king of the castle, but he didn't realize that the foundation was made of sand. I spent the next 3 days analyzing every contract we had ever signed. I realized that Richard had never actually signed a single major deal without my signature right next to his. He didn't have the legal authority to act alone on the Henderson account or the city's new library project. I sat back and looked at the screen. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. "You think I am the strong one who can start over, Lydia?" I whispered to the empty room. "Well, you were right. I am strong, and I am about to show you exactly how strong a woman can be when she decides to take her life back." I picked up the phone and made a call to a man named Thomas Thorne. He was the CEO of our biggest competitor, a firm that had been trying to buy us out for years. "Thomas," I said when he answered, "this is Martha. I am ready to sell my shares, but I have some very specific conditions." I could hear the excitement in his voice. He knew that with my shares, he would effectively own the rights to our firm's portfolio. And more importantly, he would have the power to trigger that non-compete clause against Richard. As I hung up the phone, I looked at my hands. They were still red, they were still sore, but they were no longer shaking. I had moved from the valley of shadows into the light of a new plan. Richard and Lydia thought they had stolen my empire. They didn't realize I was about to burn it down with them inside. The meeting took place on a Tuesday morning in a quiet, dimly lit booth at the back of an old-fashioned steakhouse in downtown Hartford. I chose this place because it was the kind of establishment where business was done in whispers, far away from the prying eyes of the local architectural community. I arrived 15 minutes early. I was no longer wearing my diner apron. I had pulled a classic navy blue blazer from the back of Clara's closet and polished my old leather briefcase until it shone. I may have been sleeping on a guest bed, but today I needed to look like the woman who had built an empire. Thomas Thorne arrived exactly on time. He was a man in his late 60s, with silver hair and eyes as sharp as a hawk. For 10 years, he had been our firm's fiercest rival. We had fought over every major contract in the state. He respected me. And quite frankly, he feared me. He knew that Richard was just the salesman, and he knew that I was the one who actually understood how to put a building together. "Martha," he said, taking a seat across from me. He didn't offer a handshake, just a nod of deep respect. "I heard about the divorce. I heard about the house. I was wondering when you would call me." "I am not here for sympathy, Thomas," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "I am here to offer you a deal that will change the landscape of this city." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the legal documents I had spent weeks preparing. I still own 45% of the shares in my former firm. Richard thinks they are worthless because he is the one sitting in the corner office. He thinks I am just a bitter ex-wife who will eventually beg him for a buyout. Thomas leaned in, his interest piqued. "And what are you offering?" "I am offering to sell you every single one of those shares," I said, "for a price that is well below market value. But there is a catch. A very specific, non-negotiable catch." I pointed to the non-compete clause in our original partnership agreement. I explained that once Thomas owned my shares, he would become the majority shareholder. According to the bylaws I had written myself, any change in majority ownership triggered a mandatory review of all employment contracts. "The moment you buy these shares," I whispered, "you trigger the non-compete clause against Richard. He will be legally barred from practicing architecture within 50 miles of this office for 5 full years. He will be out of a job, out of a career, and blacklisted from every major project in the tri-state area." Thomas looked at the papers, then back at me. A slow, appreciative grin spread across his face. "You are a cold one, Martha. You built that firm with him, and now you are handing me the keys to destroy him." "I didn't destroy him, Thomas," I replied. "He destroyed our partnership the moment he brought my sister into our bed. I am simply exercising my legal rights as a business owner." I picked up my pen. It was a heavy gold fountain pen that Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary. The irony was not lost on me. As I pressed the nib to the paper and signed my name Martha Elizabeth Vance, I felt a strange sensation. For months, I had felt like a victim. I had felt like a woman who had been discarded like a piece of old furniture. But as the ink dried on that contract, that feeling vanished. I wasn't just selling a business. I wasn't just giving away 45% of my life's work. I was buying my freedom. I was purchasing the right to watch Richard fall under the weight of his own arrogance. "It is done," Thomas said, tucking the signed papers into his folder. "The check will be wired to your private account by the end of the day." "And Martha, what are you going to do now?" I stood up and straightened my blazer. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. "I'm going to buy a new car, Thomas. And then I'm going to find a very comfortable chair and wait for the news." 2 weeks later, the news came. Richard was escorted out of the office by security. He had tried to fight the non-compete, but Thomas Thorne had a legal team that was twice as large and 3 times as mean as anything Richard could afford. Because Richard had been using company funds to pay for Lydia's lavish lifestyle, Thomas also hit him with a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty. Richard was not just unemployed, he was radioactive. No firm would touch him. He was a man who had lost his throne, and he didn't even have the skills to build a new one. Justice is often described as a sudden lightning bolt, but in reality it is more like slow-moving water. It erodes the foundation of a lie until the whole structure simply collapses. Without his $200,000 a year salary, Richard's life began to unravel at an alarming speed. He had always been terrible with money. He believed that the credit cards would always work, and that the bank would always be his friend. But banks are not friends to people without jobs. I stayed in a small, beautiful apartment on the other side of town, far away from our old neighborhood. I used the money from Thomas Thorne to invest in a new boutique consulting firm. I didn't need a fancy office. I just needed my brain and my reputation. Slowly, the clients who had left Richard began to find their way to me. They didn't care about the gossip. They cared about the fact that my buildings actually got finished on time. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on the house. Our old house. The property taxes in our town were brutal. On a home valued at over $700,000, the taxes were nearly $20,000 a year. Add to that the cost of heating a 5-bedroom house, the landscaping fees, and the mortgage payments Richard had taken out to pay for Lydia's new car. By the 6-month mark, the social media posts from Lydia had changed. The photos of champagne and silk dresses were gone. Now, she was posting angry rants about unfair laws and fake friends. I heard from a neighbor that Richard had started drinking heavily. He would sit on the back porch in his bathrobe, staring at the swimming pool that was slowly turning green because they couldn't afford the chemicals to clean it. Lydia, the woman who wasn't strong enough to start over, was proving to be a disaster in a crisis. She didn't know how to cook. She didn't know how to budget. When the power was shut off for the first time, she didn't try to find a solution. She simply screamed at Richard until the neighbors called the police. Their true love, which they claimed was worth destroying a marriage for, was dying under the pressure of reality. Lydia didn't love Richard. She loved the life Richard provided. And now that the life was gone, she was beginning to see him for what he really was, a middle-aged man with no future. One morning, about a year after I had been kicked out, I decided to drive past the old neighborhood. I told myself it was for closure, but perhaps a small part of me wanted to see the truth with my own eyes. The lawn was overgrown. The white picket fence I had insisted on was peeling and grey. But the most striking thing was the sign. It was a bright, neon orange notice taped to the front door. I didn't need to get out of the car to know what it said. I had seen enough of them in my line of work. Foreclosure. The bank had taken the house. The inheritance Richard was so proud of had been swallowed up by his own debt and his own incompetence. As I sat in my car looking at the ruins of my former life, I didn't feel the joy I thought I would. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of irony. Lydia had wanted the house so badly that she was willing to steal it. She had convinced Richard that she deserved it because she was weak. And she was right. She was weak. She was so weak that she had let the most valuable asset she ever possessed slip through her fingers because she didn't have the character to maintain it. I saw a moving truck parked in the driveway. It wasn't a professional crew. It was just a battered old van. Richard was carrying a box of books, his shoulders hunched, his face looking 10 years older than it really was. Lydia was standing on the sidewalk, pointing at something and yelling. Even from the street, I could see the misery etched into their faces. They had their house. They had their love. And now, they had nothing. I realized then that the house was never the prize. The prize was the peace of mind that comes from knowing you earned everything you have. I put my car in gear and drove away. I didn't hate them anymore. You cannot hate something that has already turned to ash. I went back to my office and spent the afternoon working on a design for a new community centre. I was 61 years old, and my life was just beginning. Richard and Lydia were at the end of their road, and they had built that road themselves, one betrayal at a time. Life has a strange way of coming full circle. I have lived long enough to know that you do not always get to see the end of the story. But when you do, it is often more poetic than anything you could have imagined. It had been exactly 1 year since I watched the bank tape that orange foreclosure notice to the door of my former home. In that year, I had changed. I was 62 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was truly the captain of my own ship. My consulting business was thriving. I had more work than I could handle. And I had moved into a beautiful, sun-drenched apartment overlooking the park. I was driving my new car, a quiet, pearl-white Lexus that smelled of fresh leather and success. I was on my way to a meeting across town, and I decided to take a shortcut that led through a slightly more industrial part of the city, not far from the local municipal shelter. The light turned red at a busy intersection. I sat there, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel to the sound of a soft piano track on the radio. It was a grey, drizzly afternoon, The kind of day that makes you grateful for a heater and a roof over your head. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing on the concrete median. It was a woman. She was wearing a faded, oversized rain poncho that had seen better days. Her hair was matted and grey, tucked under a wool cap. She was holding a piece of cardboard with jagged edges. I couldn't see the words from where I was sitting, but I knew the look. It was the look of someone who had been beaten down by every choice they had ever made. As she walked closer to the line of cars, she held the sign up to my window. Hungry. Anything helps. God bless. My heart gave a strange, hollow thump. I looked at her face. Behind the grime and the exhaustion, I saw a pair of eyes that I had known since childhood. It was Lydia. She did not recognize my car. She did not recognize the woman sitting behind the tinted glass. She just saw a target. She saw a woman with a nice car who might have a few spare dollars. She leaned down, tapping her knuckle against my window, her face inches away from mine. I felt a wave of coldness wash over me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hate. It was just a profound sense of distance. I rolled down the window. The cold, damp air rushed in, bringing with it the smell of the street. "Please," Lydia whispered. Her voice was raspy, stripped of that high-pitched, girlish charm she used to get her way. "Please, ma'am, do you have any change? I just need to buy some bread. Just a loaf of bread for me and my husband. We have nothing." I looked at her. I looked at the sister who had stood in my bedroom and told me I was strong enough to be homeless. I looked at the woman who had helped Richard steal 15 years of my labor. "Lydia," I said softly. She froze. The sign in her hands trembled. Her eyes went wide, searching my face as she processed the voice, the features, and the reality of who was sitting in that driver's seat. "Martha?" she gasped. A sob broke from her throat, and she reached out as if to touch the car door, but then pulled back, looking at her own dirty fingernails. "Oh, Martha, thank God." "Thank God it's you," she began to babble, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "You have to help us, Martha. We are living in the shelter down the block. Richard is so sick. He has a lung infection, and he cannot stop coughing. They took everything from us. The bank, the lawyers. Everyone was so mean. We have been eating out of cans for months. Please, sister. You always took care of me. You were always the strong one." I listened to her. I heard her using that same word again, strong. To Lydia, being strong was an obligation I owed to her. It was my job to be strong, so that she could be weak and entitled. "Do you remember what you said to me the night you kicked me out, Lydia?" I asked. My voice was calm. It was the voice of a woman who had found her peace. "You said I was strong enough to start over, and you said you weren't." Lydia started to cry. "I was wrong. I didn't know it would be like this. Please, Martha. We are starving." I looked at the passenger seat. I had stopped at a local bakery earlier that morning to buy a fresh loaf of sourdough for my dinner. It was warm, crusty, and smelled of yeast and comfort. I picked it up. I handed the loaf of bread through the window. Lydia grabbed it with both hands, clutching it to her chest as if it were a bar of solid gold. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you, Martha. Are you coming to the shelter? Can you give us a ride?" "No, Lydia," I said. I put the car in gear as the light turned green. "I am not coming with you, and I am not giving you anything else. You wanted the life Richard provided. This is that life. It belongs to you now." I looked her in the eye one last time. "That bread isn't a gift of kindness, Lydia. Consider it a final payment. Consider it the last thing you will ever receive from the sister you betrayed." I did start over. And part of starting over is knowing who belongs in my life and who does not. I rolled up the window. Lydia stood there on the median, clutching a loaf of bread in the rain, watching as I drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I had spent 40 years looking back at her, making sure she was okay. I was done. The debt was settled. The bread was given. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely utterly light. 6 months after that day on the road, I found my true home. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't a showpiece to impress the neighbors. It was a small cedar-shingled cottage on the coast of Maine, nestled on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The house had 3 small bedrooms and a porch that faced the sunrise. I spent my mornings in the garden. I learned that the soil in Maine is rocky and stubborn, much like the people who live here. But if you work it, if you tend to it with patience and respect, it will give you something beautiful. I planted hydrangeas, roses, and a small vegetable patch. I wasn't lonely. I had found a new community. Twice a week, I volunteered at a local centre for women who were starting their lives over. Many of them were half my age, fleeing situations that felt like the end of the world. I didn't give them money. I gave them something better. I taught them how to read a contract. I taught them how to manage a budget. I told them my story, and I saw the hope return to their eyes. I realized that my 15 years with Richard weren't a waste. They were a masterclass in resilience. Everything I had learned, the business, the law, the architecture, was now being used to build a foundation for people who actually deserved it. One Saturday morning, the air was crisp and smelled of salt and pine. I was in my kitchen wearing an old apron and a pair of comfortable jeans. The sun was streaming through the window, reflecting off the blue tiles I had installed myself. I was baking bread. There is something sacred about the smell of bread baking in your own oven. It is the smell of a home that is at peace. As I kneaded the dough, feeling the warmth and the elasticity under my palms, I thought about Richard and Lydia. I had heard through the grapevine that Richard had passed away in that shelter. His body had simply given out under the weight of the stress and the choices he had made. Lydia had moved in with a distant cousin in another state, still complaining to anyone who would listen about how unfair her life had been. I didn't feel joy at their misfortune, but I didn't feel sadness either. They were ghosts from a previous life, and ghosts cannot hurt you unless you invite them in. I pulled the golden brown loaf from the oven and set it on the cooling rack. The aroma filled the house, chasing away the last lingering shadows of the past. I walked out onto my porch with a cup of tea and looked at the ocean. The waves were crashing against the rocks below, a constant, rhythmic reminder that the world keeps moving, no matter what happens to us. I had lost a house, but I had gained a soul. I had lost a husband, but I had found my own strength. I realized then that revenge isn't about making sure the other person suffers. It isn't about the grand gesture or the final word. True revenge is flourishing. True revenge is waking up in a bed you chose, in a house you earned, with a heart that no longer carries the burden of someone else's lies. Richard and Lydia thought they could build a paradise on a foundation of betrayal. They learned the hard way that such a foundation will always crumble. But my foundation? It was built on the truth. It was built with my own 2 hands. I took a deep breath of the cool Maine air and smiled. I was 63 years old. I was alone. I was at peace. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of my story. It has been a long and difficult journey, but it is a journey that I am finally proud of. As I sit here today, looking out at the blue waters of the Maine coast, I often think about the people who might be listening to this right now. Perhaps you have been betrayed by someone you loved with all your heart. Perhaps you feel as though life has dealt you a hand that is simply too heavy to carry. At 60 years old, I thought my life was over. I thought the walls of my home were the only thing keeping me safe. But I learned that a house is just wood and stone. True strength is found in the character you build when no one is watching. I gave my sister a loaf of bread that day because I wanted her to know something important. I wanted her to know that I was still a provider. I was still the one who could survive. But more than that, I wanted her to know that she no longer had a place at my table. Karma is not always a sudden lightning bolt from the sky. Most of the time, it is just the slow, steady result of the choices we make every day. Richard and Lydia chose greed. They chose betrayal. And in the end, they had to live with the consequences of those choices. If you are going through a dark time today, please remember this. You are never too old to start over. You are never too tired to build a new life. Your value does not come from a deed to a house or a balance in a bank account. It comes from the resilience in your soul. If this story touched your heart, or if you believe that justice eventually finds its way to everyone, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us continue to share these powerful lessons of life and hope with people all over the world. Before you go, I would love to hear from you. Have you ever had to start over when everyone else thought you were finished? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Note: although this story was created to be engaging and easy to follow, the message of personal strength and the value of integrity are very real. These are the lessons that truly matter. Thank you for watching. Be kind to yourself. And remember that your best days may still be waiting just around the corner. God bless.